Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Samurai 7 Retrospective. Having just looked at a samurai, it's time we look at another one. We just looked at Kanbe, so now let's look at his student, Katsushiro. Now Katsushiro is the samurai which probably grows the most in the series, and can be argued as one of the main characters. I will refrain from saying the main character, since as an ensemble piece this series doesn't really have one, but he's definitely the character that grows the most, and gets quite a bit of screen time. His evolution is a fascinating one, and for that reason will be the subject of this video. As always though, let's start with some context. Now Katsushiro introduces himself in the very first episode of the series, as he stops a thief from stealing the rice that Kiara and company bring to the city. He is immediately thanked and agrees to go with them to help defend Kana village from the bandits. In spite of his strong introduction though, and his extreme fixation with samurai ideals, he soon proves to be a bit inexperienced though, and once Kanbe joins the team, subordinates himself to him as a student. From here, Katsushiro acts as something of a personal guard for Kiara, often accompanying her and protecting her, sometimes more successfully than others. Over time, though, the two seem to grow romantically attached to each other, and this begins an odd will-they-won't-they relationship, which kinda just stays in the background of the series the whole time, but is definitely impactful of it. Before this relationship goes too far, though, the group of course has to leave the city, and of course Katsushiro is part of this. By this point, he is engaged in multiple fights with varying levels of success, and has learned quite a bit. In the caves, he's put out of commission for a bit by a dart which hits him in the leg, although this soon proves to be a boon, as it means he can successfully act as a reserve force of sorts and rescue Kikuchiyo and help win the battle in the desert. Once the group makes it to Kana, Katsushiro serves as a sentry, and even kills an enemy scout. This is his first kill in combat, and it greatly shakes him, although with Kanbe and Kiara's help, he overcomes this, and eventually goes on to successfully contribute to the defense of the village. He has survived his first major battles, and even witnessed the death of a compatriot, having seen Gorobe die in his very arms. Still resolute to be a samurai though, he hopes to accompany Kanbe in his quest to rescue the women, although is disappointed and hurt when Kanbe leaves him behind to go off on his own. Eventually though, he still resolves to help Kanbe in any way he can, and takes part in a futile attempt to rescue him. Although again, this should be noted as futile, as Kanbe proves capable of handling himself, and Ukiyo cancels the execution anyways. The two are reunited however, and this sees Katsushiro go off on Kanbe, for the latter's lack of faith in his student. This tirade sees Kanbe discipline Katsushiro, and Kiara even go up and slap him. Now mad, Katsushiro decides to go off on his own, to Kana, to defend it on his own and do his own thing. Before doing this though, he has an awkward kiss scene with Kiara in some back alley, and the two are basically destined to be separate by this point. This sees Katsushiro go off on his own, back to Kana village to defend it from further bandit attacks. Along the way, he kinda grows as a person, being on this sort of pseudo-vision quest, even seeing a ghost of Gorobe, who helps guide him back to both the village and his own samurai ideals. Now arriving in Kana, Katsushiro's solo performance again turns out to be something of a boon, as he's the only one around to defend it from the first waves of attacks that the capital has directed against Kana village. From here, he kinda actually takes over the defense of Kana village, setting up lines and helping the villagers remember how to defend themselves. He sets up a good line and defends Kana village from the capital before the rest of the samurai arrive to attack it from behind. He joins the main group as they do so, and although accidentally killing Kuzuyo, proves his overall importance and skill, as he is one of only 3 survivors. In his final scenes in the story, we see him train and winter in Kana, as Kiara approaches him one last time, as he reflects upon the graves of his fallen companions. She comes on to him again, however he refuses her, and having learned much under Kanbe, proclaims that he finally understands what it's like to be a samurai. He's finally sure of himself and his path, and having walked up upon the scene by this point, Kanbe now walks up to him and gives him his sword in recognition of him and his skill as a fellow warrior. Katsushiro gratefully accepts this and thus walks off into the night on his own path, to begin his own tale. With this context elaborated upon, let's explore Katsushiro's character and development. Of all the characters, Katsushiro probably develops the most. In the beginning, he's a naive young boy, borderline incompetent, and lost in his ideals. He thinks that the proclamation of noble ideals will somehow be enough to get him through life, and that it'll shield him from all the tough parts of it. In the end, he is a competent warrior, hardened by many battles, and who has learned much about the world and himself. He is now confident and able to walk on his own. To examine this process and how he got from point A to point B, let's examine his growth as a warrior, his growth as a thinker, and his growth as a person. Now as a warrior, Katsushiro's growth is the most obvious. His martial skills greatly improve, and he even shows himself to be a decent commander when the occasion calls for it. Early on, Katsushiro gets bodied quite often, and while good at holding Kiara's hand, admittedly doesn't seem too good for too much else as the series begins. He has a habit of bungling jumps, which I consider a clever display of inexperience by the production team, and his techniques lack a lot of the refined grace we see exercised by the more skilled veterans. Instead, his sword techniques tend to reflect the primal fear and fury within him, as we see him recklessly sling his sword about in a sort of primal fear and rage. Again, this reflects on his inexperience, as he hasn't quite learned to control himself or his emotions in the midst of combat. However, from the start, it's evident that Katsushiro's techniques, even if unrefined and bungled, show a lot of heart, and this gives him a good base to work from. While he still lacks a great deal of grace by the final episode, he's definitely competent now, and has become an objectively better fighter, even borderline good. But, under all this skill development lies a deeper core of mental development. As the series progresses, we see Katsushiro go from a naive young lad, blindly following and attached to his ideals, to a man who knows the way of the world and can truly appreciate what it means to be a samurai. The critical watershed in this is when Katsushiro takes his first kill. While beforehand he proclaims the brave nature and necessity of combat, he had never actually done much of it before and never actually killed someone doing it. Doing so finally shows him the grim nature of the world, and the fact that his ideals will not shield him. While he did do it for a noble cause, he still killed someone, and thus committed an unnoble act. This opens up Katsushiro's eyes to the magnitude of what he signed up for, the magnitude of his life decisions and where he's at the moment, and the magnitude of his path ahead of him. He finally internalizes that his ideals are not always enough to get him through life, and that no matter what he does and no matter how morally he tries to live, there will always be some dirt on his hands no matter what he does. Initially, Katsushiro is very distraught at this revolution, and is only kind of helped out of it by Kanbe and Kiara. From here, Katsushiro starts to accept the facts on the ground and grow into his own self, as he matures and learns to apply his ideals to the world as much as he can, but slowly accepts the fact that they will not be enough to get him through on their own, and that there are situations where his ideals might be compromised. While he does get a little jaded from time to time, though, his maturation is for the most part good, and he does so a great deal. And this leads to his innermost development, his development as a person. Now Katsushiro's tale is a coming of age of sorts. He goes from a boy with a vision to a man with learning. Most notably, he becomes a man who can stand on his own. In the beginning, it's obvious that Katsushiro hasn't quite cemented who he is as a person. His identity is still coming together, and he is a young man finding himself, and trying to answer who he really is at his core, who he is as a person. This explains his obsession with samurai ideals, as they serve as a starting point, something to define him and guide him and help form himself, a sort of template, if you will. To further his guidance and growth, Katsushiro assigns himself to a teacher, Kanbe, and even plays into a sort of pseudo-romance of sorts, the one he has with Kiara. Now, these are acts of an insecure young man looking for support and purpose in order to shore up his own identity. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Nope, I see no issue with someone looking to someone else for advice or guidance if they themselves are uncomfortable in their current situation. No one is born the person they are at 40, and instead gets there over time, via many layers of personal growth, personal experiences, and personal interactions with those around them. No one gets there alone either. And everyone, at least to some extent, is shaped by someone else for better and worse. Katsushiro serves as a very good, realistic model of someone growing over time and being shaped by those around him and the circumstances around him. He isn't some idealized youth who's great at everything right off the bat, and he isn't some complete downer who hates everything. No, instead he's a young man who, while wanting to do the best and be the best version of himself, is aware that he's not necessarily that good yet and isn't even quite sure of who he is yet. It's a very realistic example in this sense, and is a great example of how someone can be helped by those around them to discover themselves, and thus discover the world and be able to stand more on their own, more independent of both their ideals and others. Now this process of course takes the entire series and begins with Katsushiro divorcing his rose-tinted glasses on the samurai ideals and the world. Katsushiro himself inadvertently kicks this process off by joining up with the team in the first place, and both Kanbe and Kiara support him through it in their own ways. The support they offer allows Katsushiro to accept the realities of the world and how they conflict with his views, as opposed to outright rejecting his initial views. This means that Katsushiro can learn without becoming completely jaded, and he can develop without completely abandoning who he was in the beginning. And as he learns more of himself, and his independence grows as well as his world experiences shape him. Another key experience I would like to note on to support this is Katsushiro learning how harsh life can be, and this is best exemplified by his failure to rescue Kanbe. While him and Kikuchiyo try very hard to, and it's obvious that they're very personally invested in this endeavor, it's also obvious that had they been the only option to rescue Kanbe, and Kanbe couldn't handle himself, and Kanbe would probably be dead by episode 20. I note this because failure is a great motivator and teacher, and in this case, Katsushiro learns the need to up his game. He sees his failure and reflects upon it, and this both drives him to become a better samurai and become a better independently functional person. He realizes that while those around him supporting him is great, he needs to be able to support them in turn, and that he needs to be able to do so on his own, should the circumstances require it, in order to support those around him, in order to make sure that he can be the strongest and best possible teammate possible. And of course this applies to all of us as well, as the stronger we are as individuals, the better we can support those around us. And while Kiara does show her support for this endeavor, Katsushiro's failure means that he doesn't really have much to show Kanbe in the end. And this helps kick off the spat which sees the two separate, and sees Katsushiro leave the group, and kind of Kiara from this point. Now, quick note on the romance aspect of Katsushiro's character. While this aspect does seem a bit awkward at times and undercooked, it's sort of always there in the background. It's never unrealistic or completely negative either. Instead, again, I'd like to note Katsushiro's character aspect here as something of a very realistic and therefore genuine approach to this kind of thing. It's an awkward romance that two youths form because they seem to like each other and have their best intentions in mind. They want to support someone that they like, even if that attraction doesn't have the most concrete foundation. Instead, this is a genuine and accurate representation of two well-meaning but naive people trying to help each other and things simply falling through. While it is often a little cooked and kind of pierces the story in odd places, it is consistent enough where it doesn't come off as tacky, and the two genuinely seem to learn and care about each other. They seem to benefit from each other as well, and take a lot of comfort in each other's support when they do give it. Katsushiro is given a sort of goal and validation, and definitely emotional support, while Kiara seems to get something like that in return, in addition to some validation for getting the samurai on board in the first place. She doesn't feel as bad about it because Katsushiro's growth makes it obvious that they all signed up for this voluntarily. And while the two do separate, the fact that they part amicably in the end is also another sign of growth, as it means that they are mature enough and have grown enough to respect each other and move on. Anyways, as Katsushiro learns to stand on his own, his identity starts to crystallize into his true adult form, his final form as you will. This creates a new sense of independence, and the second step of becoming his final form, no longer requiring validation from others. That's not to say Katsushiro doesn't appreciate validation from others, and it's definitely not to say he becomes a sort of heartless Sigma male, but instead he realizes that he doesn't need approval from others to feel good about who he is as a person. He can be confident in himself, and that he doesn't need the validation of others to do so. This newfound independence, however, helps explain his rebellious streak later on in the series. Although by this point he's confident in himself enough, and realizes the gravity of the situation enough to the point where he doesn't overcorrect. He's now confident in himself, and confident in that he can be a good team member, which he does do in the final battle. But he doesn't isolate himself, he doesn't cut himself off, and he doesn't abandon the team completely. It's just that finally, having been through all of this, and growing enough, he's grown to the point where he now understands his own path, and who he is as a person, and how to move on. He understands how to be a strong individual, and therefore help contribute to a strong team. He's confident of who he is, and no longer seeks the validation from social norms or from others, as he so sought from Kanbe, Kiara, and even Kuzio at times. No, instead now, he is his own man, with his own identity. This is confirmed by him going off on his own quest in the final episode. He's his own person now, and no longer needs validation from others, or his original naive ideals. Instead, he can now seek validation from his own set of ideals which he has crafted and shaped over the course of this series, a set of ideals which is more realistic and applicable than the naive ones he started with. Instead, now, he can seek validation from himself, and his own ideals, and his own quest, and his own person.